Not naming any names here, but there is a saxophone professor in the UK that I've heard speak quite a few times, and every time I've heard him speak, he says your mouthpiece doesn't matter. Now I understand where he's coming from. He's saying, you know, your mouthpiece isn't going to make you a better player. You can't just buy a new mouthpiece and expect yourself to sound like a better player. However, I do also disagree with him in the respect that I think different mouthpieces can give you a different quality of sound, and they can make you sound different. I've been playing soprano saxophone for over a year now, and I've gone through I think about 8 or 9 different mouthpieces, and it's something that I've spent a lot of money on trying to find that perfect mouthpiece. And I guess what I want to share with you today is what I wish I'd known a year ago when I started buying different mouthpieces. I think this video is going to be most useful for you if you've been playing soprano saxophone for a little while and perhaps you've been playing on the stock mouthpiece that it came with. I suppose as you start to advance, you'll notice that it has some shortcomings and you can't necessarily express yourself in the way that you want to, whereas a new mouthpiece might be able to help you with that. So I have 6 different mouthpieces that I'm going to play for you, and I'm going to talk about each one individually, so let's get started. So the first mouthpiece that I'm playing on is a Yamaha 4C plastic mouthpiece. Now this is the control experiment. This is the stock mouthpiece that came with my Yamaha 475 soprano. Now I was really surprised by this mouthpiece because it's not one that I've played on a lot. When I got this saxophone, I already had a couple of other mouthpieces that I was used to playing on, so I just went straight to those mouthpieces. Now, going back to this one, I thought it was really nice. So the horseshoe chamber on this mouthpiece is a really nice balance between a pure and a focused sound and a more mellow and a darker tone. So it has a little bit of bite to it, but it's also quite a soft sound, and I really like that. The tip opening isn't too wide, but it's also not super closed. Now the tip opening is something that I'm going to talk about a lot, so I might as well explain it now. The tip opening is the distance between the tip of your mouthpiece and the reed. Now if you have a small tip opening, it means that the reed is very close to the tip of the mouthpiece and it doesn't have as much distance to travel in order to close over the mouthpiece. Now a wider tip opening obviously has a bigger gap, so the reed has further to go and it has more that it needs to bend in order to close over the mouthpiece. Now this is important because a reed on its own is just a piece of wood, nothing is going to happen. It needs the mouthpiece to help it resonate and produce a sound. So if you're using a wider tip opening, you've essentially got more work to do in order to make a sound. Now the obvious trade-off here is if you have a wider tip opening, just use a softer reed, and this is a solution that most people use. However, you don't want a reed that's too soft or your sound will be a bit out of tune and a bit sloppy and it will sound a little bit flat. On the other hand though, if you have a tiny tip opening and a soft reed, nothing's really going to happen. You're going to strangle the reed, which means you're going to essentially bite too much and the reed's going to stop vibrating. So you need a harder reed to produce a more consistent tone, and it also will sound a lot fuller and a lot richer. However, when we're looking at the Yamaha 4C, the tip opening being 1.2mm is actually a little bit of an advantage because it's not super open, but it's not super closed. It's somewhere in the middle, so you can go in any direction really. Now, I wouldn't say the Yamaha 4C is a particularly good mouthpiece to progress on, and I only say that because it's got a few limitations. One is that it's made of plastic, which is not inherently a bad thing, but I think it is going to limit the amount that you can play and the amount that you can resonate, and I guess somewhere down the line you're probably going to find that you need to upgrade again. So the next mouthpiece is where we start to create a divide. So this is a Selmer S90 170. So this is a very, very close tip opening. This is a 1.07mm tip opening. So basically as closed as you can get for a soprano. Now, one thing that's great about this mouthpiece is it's got a square chamber, so it's a very pure and classical sound, almost like an oboe. And with the tip opening being so small, it's very easy to produce a sound. So if you're more of a beginner or lower intermediate and you're struggling to get a sound out of your saxophone, using a mouthpiece with a closed tip opening is going to make it much easier for you to produce a sound. With the S90, the intonation is consistent across the range. It sounded really nice, and again it gave you a very pure and a sweet tone, which is something that I think is perfect for classical music. In a very similar vein, the Selmer Concept is a similar mouthpiece. There's only 0.1 of a millimeter difference in the tip opening, so it's a very easy mouthpiece to play. It has a round chamber, so it has a slightly fatter sound, and by that I mean it has a bit more depth, it's a little bit darker, it's not as pure and as sort of in your face, I suppose, as the S90 is. I was playing on the Concept when I first started learning to play soprano saxophone. I thought it was a really good mouthpiece to start on, however it did have a few limitations. I think maybe I wasn't as experienced as I needed to be to play a mouthpiece like this, but I found in the lower range of the soprano, I had a really hard time getting a sound out of this instrument. Like I said, if you combine a small tip opening with a soft reed, you are going to strangle the reed. So that's when you bite down too hard and the reed stops vibrating because it doesn't have any room to vibrate. That being said, with a smaller tip opening, you can get into the highest extremes of the saxophone range very easily, and you can get a very nice pure sound at the top. So that's above the C, using all your palm keys up to the F sharp. I think for a Selmer Concept to work at its best, you need a very hard reed. It's not all bad though, because there are mouthpieces by Selmer which can produce a classical tone that have a wider tip opening. So I have another S90, but the tip opening here is much different. The S90 comes in different sizes, so there's 170, 180, 190 and 200. I have the 200, which is the widest tip opening that they have. So now we have a square chamber for that pure focused sound. However, with the wider opening, we have a lot more flexibility with what we can do. It allows you to use a softer reed for a start, which might be easier for certain people. However, you do need to watch your tuning, because with a wider tip opening, a lot more of the control is here. If you find yourself going flat, it's because you're not closing the reed against the mouthpiece with enough force. So it's definitely a balancing act. On the smaller end, you have a small tip opening, you're going to strangle the reed, you're going to close too much. With a wider tip opening, you need to make sure you close enough, because if you don't, you're going to be flat. If we wanted to look at something a bit jazzier, we do have the Otto Link Tone Edge 5. So this is a very similar tip opening to the S90 200. So it's got a similar tip opening to the S90, however, it's going to have a bit of a jazzier sound because of the way the mouthpiece has been made. So this mouthpiece has a round chamber, so it's got a very fat and a very dark tone to it, which I think is very nice for soprano because it can sound quite shrill sometimes. Now, some people don't like that, some people really want to sound like an oboe, and other people want to sound a bit more mellow and a little bit jazzier, and I think the Tone Edge really achieves this. I find that I can be very expressive with this mouthpiece, and I can make bends, and I can sound a little bit more jazzy, and I can do a lot more with it, and I think that's because I have that wider tip. So I can use my lips a lot more to produce expression. One problem that I do have with the wider tip opening is that I find that the higher extremities of the range, so this is all the palm keys, can be quite difficult to produce a sound with. I do need to be careful because if I'm playing up on like a palm key D, E, F, I don't always get a note out, and I know that's because of my lack of experience, but I need to figure out what kind of calibration I need between the mouth and the mouthpiece in order to make that sound. But down in the bottom of the range, I find it much easier to get a sound out than I would with, say, a Concept. So another generality that I think you should think about is the smaller the tip opening, the easier the high notes will be and the harder the low notes will be. And it's reversed for the wider tip opening. High notes are difficult, low notes tend to be a lot easier. And that brings us to our final mouthpiece, and that's this one here, and my favourite mouthpiece, and the one that I'm currently using. This is a Yanagisawa Metal mouthpiece, and it's a 7. So while tip openings can be measured in inches, millimetres, each brand of mouthpiece also has their own sizes. So this is a 7, but it's a 1.52 millimetre opening. I tend to go down a reed size for this one, so I use a 2.5 Lupifaro Evo reed. So it's a metal mouthpiece, which means it's very resonant and it produces a very loud sound. So I play in a big band and it's ideal for that, so my sound can cut through. It's also got a square chamber, which for a long time I associated with classical music, but I know that that's not necessarily the case anymore. The square chamber on this mouthpiece produces a very focused and pure sound, as I've kept saying, but it gives it more of like a trumpety quality. So it's not super shrill, but it's a bit more brassy, I guess you could say. So combining those two things, the metal, the square chamber, and then also the wide tip opening, you end up with an incredibly expressive mouthpiece that allows you to do a lot of things. You could definitely try and play classical music on this, but because the tip opening's quite wide, I think you're going to find it quite hard to stay in tune and to produce like very intricate notes and very intricate patterns on this mouthpiece. I think something a little closer to the S90 will be more ideal for that. That being said, who's to say you can't play classical music on a metal mouthpiece, or vice versa? I feel like there's a lot of influence from teachers and people on YouTube who tell you what you need to do, because there are certain rules in the saxophone community that have always been rules, and that's the way it should be. So for example, small tip opening, classical. Big tip opening, jazz. I know that's kind of what I've reiterated here, because there is some truth to it. However, if you're playing jazz and you're a bit of a beginner, don't get a massive tip opening like this one, because you're going to really struggle to play. And it might benefit you in the long term, but it's going to take a long time to get there, and it's going to be a slog, and it's going to be difficult. I think ultimately what you need to do is find a mouthpiece that's going to suit you in the long term. So something that's going to work for whatever range of music it is that you're playing. If you're only ever going to play in a big band and you're only ever going to play jazz, maybe you should get something like this. If you're going to do different types of gigs and you're going to be playing with different groups of people and different musicians, maybe get something a bit more in the middle that's going to allow you to do both. I wouldn't worry too much about, am I a jazz player or am I a classical player? Because most people aren't these days. I play a lot of different things. If you're kind of not sure what you want to do and you're stuck in the middle, go for a mouthpiece that produces a sound that you want to sound like. So I'm not saying go and buy all 6 of these mouthpieces and you'll be covered. Pick what's best for you and really think about it before you put it in your basket, because it's a lot of money and I wish I didn't have all these mouthpieces, to be honest with you. I wish I had like 3. I don't need 8 or however many I do have. So yeah, that's it from me. Hopefully you found that useful. I know this is a long video, but hopefully it has given you something to think about. And that's it. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and if you have enjoyed, please give me a thumbs up. Leave a comment, let me know what mouthpiece you use, or if you have any recommendations. And of course, subscribe and you'll be notified whenever a new video comes out. Have a great day. I'll see you next time.